from Pro Football Focus, Sam Monson. Sam, thanks for joining the show, man. What's up? How are you?
No problem. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I want to talk Commanders draft with you, but I also want to talk just like general draft strategy with you, because I think for me, this draft cycle was so informative. This is the deepest I've ever gone in the draft, covering a team that had the number 2 pick, and especially looking at quarterback. You just look at it deeper, and also covering competent people. You're like, oh, this matters, as opposed to the people that have been making the picks here in the past, namely Bruce Allen, when I was on the beat back from 2015 to 2019 for me. So when you think about like what the Commanders did draft wide, what are the things that you see in it that you go like, oh, this is reminiscent of what Adam Peters has done before in San Francisco, or what they did in Denver when he was there, New England when he was there, that you're like, I see the good team building here, presuming that you see good team building there?
Yeah, I mean, obviously they chose to go quarterback at the top of the draft. There didn't seem to be much of a chance that they were going to do anything other than that. I think New England was the team that maybe could have elected to go in a different direction and trade out of that pick and maybe build the infrastructure first. Washington was starting from a better point of view, certainly in terms of receiving help, so they could talk themselves into the quarterback and succeed right away. But then really, you look at the first sort of 5 picks, they just started picking off value and solid players and, didn't do anything crazy. I think the big thing of this draft was drafting as many times as you can, getting the quarterback at the top, and then just get as many good players in the building as you can. The only thing I think that you would quibble with is the lack of offensive line kind of, reinforcements. I know they got Brandon Coleman in the 3rd round, but that was pick number 5 for them by the time they eventually got around to the offensive line, when they were one of those teams where you were saying, okay, if they get the quarterback at the top of the draft, we're going to circle back around the next couple of picks and get offensive linemen. Though I think there were good reasons for avoiding that in terms of value players falling to their next picks, but it meant that they were late in addressing that offensive line.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing that I've definitely struggled with as an analyst this time around with this team, and tried to exercise some patience and give them the benefit of the doubt almost, is like, they had a lot of problems. Like, they got here, I think they looked at the roster and they went, yikes, this is worse than we thought. And that means you're not going to be able to fix everything in 1 year. And so how do you go about, I don't mean this in like a PFF grades everything, and, we kind of have some fun with that from time to time, as everyone does. You guys have fun with it. I love your podcast open where you have all the people complaining about the PFF grades. So to be clear, like, I'm not poking fun here, but like, in terms of grading the draft, balancing that, like, well, they did take the best player available with like, yeah, there's this other need, but they had so many needs. Was it reasonable to ask them to fill it anyway?
Yeah, I mean, this is why, on our podcast, we talk about the idea is to go into a draft never needing massive glaring needs all the way through. Obviously, quarterback is a different thing. You either need a quarterback or you don't. But the idea is you want to get into a draft without having glaring holes on the roster that you have to fill with certain draft picks, because if you do that, you've got to take those players and you have to get a guy that you expect to come in and contribute. And that leads you to ignoring players that were potentially better players at different positions. So the alternative is, like Washington, where maybe they would have wanted to go offensive line with the 36th overall pick, but suddenly Johnny Newton's available and you're like, well, he's too good to pass on at this point. So let's come back again for the offensive line later. And then Mike Sanders still is available. So you're like, all right, one more pick. And it just sort of gets kicked down the road a bit. The problem, I think, occurs, like, ordinarily I would say that's the right strategy. Just take the best players, come back for the needs later on. I think it potentially changes the math a little bit, though, when you just drafted a quarterback at number 2 overall and the offensive line in front of him on paper isn't good. Suddenly you don't have the luxury anymore of just picking the best players. You need to say what's going to help this guy succeed quickly, or what's going to give him the best chances of succeeding. And that's offensive line, that's receivers, those kinds of things. So I think that's the only time where you kind of question what they were doing a little bit. You're right. They've got needs in a lot of places. These were all good picks, but the most important thing for this team is the quarterback they just drafted.
Yeah, no doubt. PFF Sam Monson with us here on the Hoffman Show. There's a quote that Adam Peters gave somewhere in the process that I thought was always really interesting, and one that I came back to, which is, we're people drafting people. And there's so much talk about the character of these players. And I think when you look at their class, like bunch of team captains, bunch of leaders, guy like Sainer still, you can't find anybody that dislikes him. It's hard to find anybody that doesn't absolutely love the kid because of who he is. As you kind of go through your draft process, and especially as you've covered the league now for as long as you have, you start to build sources in the league. Has how you think about that part of the draft evolved at all in terms of the people versus just the tape?
I think that's always the most difficult element to evaluate from the outside, right? Because that's where coaches or teams have the advantage with the one-on-one meetings, with the interviews at the combine, with the 30 visits, all those things that they get access to that the rest of us don't. We can only kind of evaluate, what you see from the outside on tape and the red flag type of stuff that becomes public information. Outside of that, it's very difficult to get a handle on, this guy is an amazing person. Everyone loves him. He's a team leader versus another guy who isn't, but they're comparable football players. It probably makes a difference, but how much is really difficult to put a handle on and put a value on. So every single NFL team says something along those lines, that we're chasing. Like nobody's out here going, we're looking for assholes that nobody likes, right? Doesn't matter for us. We're just looking for the best players. Doesn't matter if he's a tool. Doesn't matter if he's great. Don't care if he's a leader. Like everyone's looking for the same thing. They want great people, great leaders, awesome human beings. So the fact that they all articulate that means there's probably something to it, but it's very, very difficult to quantify. And even they, I don't think, try and quantify it as much as just identify it and say, this is somebody that we should be targeting because of these traits.
Well, so that's the thing that I think for me during this draft process evolved in my thinking is I like everyone else was always like, yeah, you'd rather have the good guys. But I think what I see with a guy like Peters is, and why he ultimately might get revered as like one of the great talent evaluators in the sport is I think he prioritizes it more. And because it's not just like so that you have a team full of guys that you don't have to worry about getting the call from the local police department about. It's you look at some of the guys that he's taken that have developed at the pro level, and it's about their football character. And like, do these guys have an upward trajectory? Do these guys ultimately become better players? Do we get their best football as opposed to them just kind of being the players they were in college? And I look at a place like Detroit and what Dan Campbell and Brad Holmes have built. I think they do the same thing. And that's kind of why I wanted to ask you about this on top of just the players, as someone who watches so much film and has studied so much of this stuff and team building and looks at this stuff in a really smart way. I think for me, that was like a kind of a big revelation this draft cycle of the best teams seem to prioritize that versus just giving it lip service. And I'm curious if you've noticed that or disagree with that in your observations over the years.
I think there's definitely some very smart teams that do prioritize it. I think there's other smart teams and good teams that don't, though. So I think part of it is one of these things of it's almost like looking for the patterns. When you see a good team and they're doing that, it's like, well, this is obviously what everybody should be chasing. I don't know that there's like it's that linear a thing that the smart teams do this, the dumb teams don't, and that's the difference. I think it is one of those things that all things being equal, you would obviously rather have the better person, the better self-starter, the better leader, all those kinds of things, the better football character. But I don't know that it should be necessarily, one of the most important things you're prioritizing in all of this. I think it's definitely one of the variables and probably a significant tiebreaker in a lot of cases. But I think there's other elements that should probably be more important when you're looking at things.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably right. The tiebreaker, I think, is a good way to put that, because if a guy can't play, then like he can be he can work really hard. I can work really hard at football. I'm not going to play in the NFL. Sam Monson's with us here on the Hoffman Show. As for the quarterback they took, what do you make of the pick of Daniels at 2, the fit with Kingsbury, and how quickly he can become a good NFL quarterback, which is obviously what you want out of a number 2 pick?
Yeah, I think most people at PFF would have sided with Drake May over Jayden Daniels, but certainly personally, I thought it was close enough that I wouldn't even disagree with anybody that put it the other way around, like Washington. I think that's just the way they came down on what was a very close, razor's edge of a decision between those two guys. To me, it was Caleb Williams as the number 1 quarterback, and then a gap, and then the rest of them, and they all have sort of something to be scared of. They've all got traits that impressed you and that you want to attach yourself to. And it's just sort of which one is the combination that you're least scared of or most drawn to. Daniels coming off an amazing season last year with some incredible accuracy, some really impressive big time throws. Obviously, his athleticism is crazy good. But the things that you need to be a little bit concerned by are, does he expose himself to too many hits? Does he take too many sacks, period, just trying to run around and make some plays? And these are things that are vaguely sticky from the college level to the NFL level. It tends to be, that's just the type of player you are, and that's going to take some work. The Kingsbury offense, I think, is an interesting element because we need to see what the next evolution of that is. He came into the NFL running effectively, a pure air raid offense, and that lasted like 2 weeks before he was like, okay, that can't fly. We can't run 10 personnel the whole time in the NFL. It doesn't work. The defenses are too different. So he adjusted several times actually in that first sort of year or two, and then kind of stopped and stopped evolving that system to a degree, and was stuck in a couple of things that he wanted to keep doing that were different from the way the rest of the NFL was going. So I'm kind of fascinated to see, has he evolved now that he's had some time off? Have we got new wrinkles to this offense? Has he shown, because he's shown in the past, obviously, the capacity to develop that system. It's not like other offenses or defenses that have come into the league, been really good for a couple of years, and then just never changed, and the league figured it out and it's done. He has shown the capacity to change it. He just stopped doing it at some point. And so I think that's going to be a big element is, number one, what exactly is this Cliff Kingsbury offense going to look like now? And then how does Jayden Daniels do within it?
Yeah. What do you make? One of the most interesting picks, I think, on that front is Ben Sinnott, the tight end from Kansas State, who Adam Peters kind of compared to some little George Kittle-y, but the Kyle Juszczyk comparison is the one that really caught my attention, because that kind of piece, like, obviously doesn't exist in the initial iteration of Kingsbury's offense. There's no fullback or tight end in that iteration, and this guy is a guy that can do both. What do you make of that pick and how it fits with some of the offensive minds here in DC, whether it be Kingsbury, Brian Johnson, Anthony Lynn, anybody else?
Yeah, and yet he's very receivery, for a tight end / for an H-back. He's a real sort of receiver at that position. Like, he actually looked like a wide receiver running around there in college, much more kind of slight than some of these other giant tight ends that were getting drafted. So, yeah, I think he is a kind of versatile chess piece within this offense that can move around and fill that kind of additional large-bodied role outside of the receivers that they're going to want to play. So from that perspective, I think it makes a lot of sense within the offense.
Sam Monson from Pro Football Focus. What's your guys' schedule now that the draft is over? Do you actually take some time off? Or are you going to just dive into more looking back at the draft? What's up for you guys the next couple of months and kind of this football, as dead of a time as we have? There's nothing that's dead in the NFL.
Yeah, we you're sort of so focused on the draft, and you're like, we can just get to the end of the draft and it's all good. But actually, the week following the draft is just as busy, because we do like a daily recap show going through everybody's draft. And then next week, it'll be the first week that it actually cools down a bit. So take a few days off then, and then we're sort of just into our off-season content. And for us, that's some of the fun stuff, right? We get a chance to talk some ridiculous stuff and crazy sort of submissions that people have emailed in, and just random topics that we want to hit over the course of the off season. Just have a bit of fun until the season rolls around again and we start analyzing the real stuff.
Yeah, no, it's a wacky time of year to do, whether it's a podcast or radio show, but you guys do a great job. Sam Monson, just search PFF in your podcast feed. It'll pop right up. He's their lead football analyst. Sam, appreciate the time. Thanks so much, man.
Anytime. Take it easy.
This is The Hoffman Show on the Team 980 and the Odyssey app.